I think it's interesting, Garan, to look at the impact that the pandemic has had on financial services providers. I mean, it strikes me that exactly the same, if you like, high standards of ethics and conduct are going to be required, especially in light of some of the changes. So, for example, remote or hybrid working practices that have been put in place, and that surely, for example, the FCA will stand back and say, okay, have you still met those standards? And if you haven't, then rather than saying you've got an excuse because there was a pandemic, I suspect the FCA will be saying, well, you've fallen short and you've actually failed to put in place, the changes that perhaps remote working require. I mean, is that your take on this too?
Yeah, very much so, Dan. I mean, I think there's a couple of important points to bear in mind. I mean, I think that right at the start of the pandemic, if we cast our minds back to March time of last year, clearly the FCA was very much focused, as was the Bank of England and the Treasury, making sure the economy survived. So that was its immediate focus in the immediate sort of days and weeks of the pandemic crisis. But as you say, it's very clear to me that the FCA's enforcement focus on ensuring that there's proper market conduct and customers being treated fairly and that firms playing by the rules, that didn't change at all. The policy of credible deterrence, which is underlying the FCA's enforcement mantra, has been the enforcement mantra for the FCA for a number of years now. The whole policy of the being sort of tough targeted action against firms who break the rules, that hasn't changed either. And I think we know that the FCA had similar issues and challenges that almost everybody did in terms of a quick move to working from home. But I know for certain that the FCA's investigations continued, interviews with firms and individuals continued. And I think if we need any evidence of the FCA's enforcement resolve, I think we should just look at the fact that I think that almost £200 million worth of fines were levied last year on firms and individuals. So I think it's clear to me that nothing really changed. It wasn't business as usual right at the start, but certainly the FCA was expecting firms and individuals to not fall below the standards that are set out in the regulatory framework.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one thing that struck me as well was that the FCA were also circulating sort of headline grabbing, almost warning notices saying, for example, if you're a bank, you must still monitor your employees. If you're obliged to record certain conversations or transactions, notwithstanding you may have a high percentage of the workforce working at home, you've still got to try and do that, because they clearly saw that kind of chasm that was opening up, the gap with people being outside the office was going to be a problem for things like supervision, for monitoring conversations. So I think you're exactly right. And that kind of uptick in investigations just shows that they were really very focused. I mean, the other thing that I was hearing a lot of as well is there was an interest around the use of, say, WhatsApp and other forms of messaging, because I think the FCA got very nervous that hybrid or remote working would lead to conversations that perhaps were completely unsuitable for, WhatsApp or text or so on, being conducted in that way. So I think looking at this in terms of how we might help firms, I mean, if you have any kind of hot tips or I know it's hard to be prescriptive, but what would your guidance be?
Well, I think one of the points that you've just sort of fastened on there, Dan, right at the start of the pandemic, the FCA was sending out very, very clear messages to the market in terms of what it expected them to do when it came to treating customers fairly at a time when a lot of people were clearly suffering a great degree of financial hardship. And I think that one of the issues that firms have, particularly sort of banks and general insurers, will be for those who didn't pay careful attention to those messages that the FCA was sending out as to what it expected. So I think really my first tip for those firms going forward is that you really need to listen very, very closely and very, very carefully to what the FCA is saying if you want to stay the right side of the line in terms of compliance and not falling into trouble and having the enforcement division knocking on your door. So things like Dear CEO letters are very important. The FCA is writing those for the benefit of its health. I think it's important that firms need to read what those messages are, that have been sent out, particularly with Dear CEO letters. I think any other publications that the FCA is putting out into the market, pay careful study. So I'm thinking of things like the FCA's annual report, its business plan, the speeches that senior officers from the FCA give at regular intervals. All of this information is readily available on the FCA's website. And it's clear that it's not just putting it there because it thinks people are going to be interested. It's because it's using these various media to send out messages to the regulated community in terms of what it regards as being good or bad market conduct and what its expectations are. So that will be my overwhelming message. Keep a very close eye in terms of what the FCA is saying to the market. And I think that will help you in terms of keeping out of trouble and transcribing that into the conduct that your firm is undertaking as a result of what the FCA is saying.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. I mean, I think one thing I'd maybe add to that is that this doesn't just apply to regulated firms, because my suspicion is, that those that are regulated have a more natural tendency to do all the things that you've mentioned because they realise they come under the auspices of the FCA.
Sure.
But then you've got, a whole band of unregulated firms and newcomers to the market who maybe don't even realise perhaps that they are transgressing. So maybe they're venturing into work that, requires authorisation. Or, I mean, a very good example now is if you have a crypto asset business, the need for registration. It might be that you don't regard your activities as being regulated as such, but the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, is now basically the anti-money laundering officer and the counter-terrorist financing officer for that. So it needs to run the rule over those businesses. So, you have all those sorts of things. I mean, again, within the world of crypto, there's also in terms of investment, certain investments now where you have a crypto asset as an underlying asset is completely banned. So you're then getting into the realms of, of criminality. So I think there's a lot there. I mean, and the other thing was we're looking at sort of, if you like, criminal prosecutions, insider trading, sort of market abuse. I would have thought those are sorts of areas where if I were the FCA, I'd also be saying, well, actually, there's going to be a bit of a rise in that because you just don't have the formality and the cohesion and perhaps the inbuilt, confidentiality that goes with all being in an office together. So I think also maybe if we're trying to give people a message, we've got to say, whether you're within or without regulation, you really need to kind of have a look at, what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point, Dan, there, actually, in terms of sort of market abuse and insider trading. I mean, the FCA has made it clear for many, many years that these type of issues are absolutely key for it, and that it wants to make sure that there is a clean market that it's responsible for regulating out there. So I think this whole issue about market abuse and insider trading has, whilst it's been very important for a number of years, has become even more important over the past sort of 18 months because we've had this almost unprecedented period of market volatility. When we saw in the early days of the pandemic, the stock exchanges around the world just absolutely plummeted, and there's been a lot of volatility since then as well. So those are the type of scenarios that give the FCA sleepless nights. And as you said, you combine that with the fact that you've got many more people working from home, people communicating more over less secure networks because precisely they are working from home, therefore they may not be sitting behind the firm's firewall, increased communication over things like WhatsApp, which are more difficult to monitor. It's almost creating a perfect storm in many senses for the ability for market abuse and insider trading to be perpetrated. And I think the other thing that sort of links onto that is the fact that the FCA will have been watching very, very carefully what it is that listed PLCs were saying to the market. And I think it'll be asking questions of those companies and its senior officers. Well, did you release market information quickly enough? The price sensitive information that you put out, was it accurate? Did you put it into the public arena quickly? It's those type of things. So I think, again, if we're looking at sort of FCA enforcement priorities, it's about market abuse, certainly, but I think it's also at a time of market volatility. How was it that the listed PLC market was dealing with price sensitive information and putting that into the public arena? And were the statements that these companies making, were they in any sense misleading? So I think that these are going to be real focuses for the FCA going forward over the next sort of 12, 24 months.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that, Karen. And I also think as well that in terms of when they're looking at misleading statements, I think they'll also drill down and look at some of the financial promotion that's been taking place, because again, that's another area where you can have companies that aren't authorised to conduct regulated work, but nonetheless they're putting out material there's effectively marketing and investment or some other activity that actually needs to be regulated. My sense of this personally is that some firms did play a bit more fast and loose during the pandemic. I think that was all kind of part of the process, and perhaps also for some firms as well, the perhaps panic or the need to try and really maximise income where they could. So, but I think the FCA are going to be very wise to that. I think that's another area where firms have to be really careful to sort of fight the tendency to want to really publicise what they're doing, but then they overstep the mark and they're actually promoting something and inducing investment or effectively inducing business that they're simply not authorised to conduct. And then I think what a lot don't realise is it's not just a case of breaching a prohibition, which is in itself a criminal offence. The money that you make from that is then effectively proceeds of crime, because I think there's a lot that firms have to take on board, and I also sympathise as well, because whilst we are just looking for strictly the financial piece, and particularly the FCA, other regulators are also going to be looking at the impacts of the pandemic. So, for example, the Information Commissioner's Office would be looking at whether data is being handled, so on and so forth. So I just mentioned that as a side issue because I think firms have so much they've got to juggle, and they've really got to steer a clear course, as you say, to be upfront and honest and make sure that they can deal with any inquiries the regulator has. I mean, on that front, would you have any advice as to what you might do if you do get an inquiry from the FCA?
I think that given that the size of the regulated community, Dan, is something like sort of 60,000 people, there are going to be a lot of firms and individuals out there that simply have not come up against the FCA's enforcement division, and they may not recognise and treat with severity that it's due the type of correspondence that they're getting from the enforcement division. So I think that my advice would be, if you do get something from the FCA and you're not sure what it is and where it might be going, then speak to your lawyers. I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I? But the best outcomes for clients that I've always acted for who've had trouble when it comes to the FCA, the ones who get the better outcomes are always the ones that speak to their legal team at an early stage, so that they can get their arms around the problem, so that they can engage properly with the FCA. And if the FCA is resolved in its intent to take disciplinary action, it's a question of then engaging constructively with the FCA, either to sort of to fight hard because you simply think the FCA has got it wrong, or if you think it's a problem, it's about trying to negotiate the best outcome you possibly can in terms of a settlement of a regulatory action with the FCA. So, I mean, just to leave everyone with a message, I think it would be twofold. Number one, keep a very close eye on what the FCA is saying and doing when it's talking about market conduct and its expectations of regulated firms and individuals. And number two, if you think there is a problem, I think I can't overstate the importance of taking advice from lawyers as soon as possible.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice, and there's little I can add. But I think one thing I would say at the end of that is also just don't assume that the law, if you like, stands still, because the FCA are also changing the rules all the time. So for example, in June, we've got new rules coming in about capital adequacy, which in turn will change, sort of the notifications that firms will need to give. So, because it's a changing landscape, that's another reason why you need to keep an eye on it. And if you can't, because you just can't understand the way through it all, then come and speak to us, because maybe we can help. So I think our overriding kind of advice is give us a call, isn't it, Karen?
Absolutely. I mean, I think certainly that issue you mentioned about capital adequacy, Dan, is going to be a real issue for a lot of IFAs up and down the country. And the sooner that you can get your arms around the problem, then the better, I think.
Yeah, I agree.